XXXVI latest Georgian and Victorian novelists. Scott's example and success naturally attracted many writers towards the novel. Byron, Shelley, Mrs. Shelley, and Claire Clairmont, with Polidori, Byron's physician, all amused themselves with writing romances in the truly horrid style during a period of rainy weather on the Lake of Geneva. Byron's first chapters of A Romance of a Vampire, with the opening scene, in the desert near Ephesus, are admirable and tantalizing. Completed as Heaven Pleased by Polidori, the story was popular on the continent, was made the theme of more than one opera, and was dramatized by Charles Nodier. Mrs. Shelley's Frankenstein, highly praised by Scott, really is very satisfactorily horrid. Her later novels are forgotten. So far, and also in the three Scottish novels of Miss Susan Ferrier, 1782–1854, there was no imitation of Scott. Indeed, her tale, Marriage, 1818, was published 4 years after Waverley. This work, with Inheritance and Destiny, contained humorous studies of Scottish character. Of these Miss Pratt is the best remembered. John Galt, 1779–1839, was a man of affairs and a prolific general writer, an acquaintance of Byron. The best of his books, The Annals of the Parish, is very good indeed. The old innocent minister records the humours and sorrows of his flock from year to year, throughout the commercial awakening of Scotland. Except for the fact that the book deals with Scottish life, it is not an imitation of Sir Walter. Nor is The Provost, or The Ayrshire Legatees, who travel south as Humphrey Clinker travelled north of Tweed, and, like Humphrey's company, narrate their adventures and record their reflections. Galt's best books are still well worth reading. They, not Scott's romances, are the ancestors of the modern Kailyard school, as it was called in its day. Beginning with an imitation of Scott, William Harrison Ainsworth, born 1805, became a literary man very young, published for the first time in A Christmas Box, Scott's Bonnie Dundee, and, as editor, advertised himself colossally. He was a strikingly handsome person, and poured out historical novels, The Tower, Rookwood, Jack Sheppard, and many others. He crammed for the historical details, of which he was too lavish, and, aided by Cruikshank's designs, attained a wide popularity, which has vanished. He continued to write almost till his death in 1882. G.P.R. James, 1799–1860, is only remembered for his famous Two Horsemen in his opening scenes. Long before his death his vogue had passed. His contemporary, Lord Beaconsfield, Benjamin Disraeli, 1804–1881, for a man so active in politics, wrote a great mass of fiction, from the Vivian Grey of his boyhood to more mature works in which many of the characters were easily recognized by contemporaries. The political novels, such as Coningsby, abound in satire, Sybil, in reflections on society. All are full of a fantasy rather oriental, and Lothair, in 1870, was as personal in its allusions as Coningsby. Ixion, and The Infernal Marriage, are brief apologues, full of mocking mirth. Everywhere there is brilliance, but substance in the way of human character and of convincing narrative is rare. The author was amusing himself and his world between the innings of a greater game. Thackeray's burlesque Codlingsby may survive Coningsby. Perhaps Thackeray's Phil Fogarty of the Fighting Onety Oneth may also outlive its originals, the military novels of Charles Lever, 1806–1872, Tales of the Camp, the March and the Battle. Yet they lose great pleasure who neglect Major Monsoon, Mickey Free, and Baby Blake. In Lever's Charles O'Malley, the Major is a jewel of a character. The early scenes at Trinity College, Dublin, and in the Galway of the old days of claret and pistols are admirable, and Lever knew many anecdotes of the Peninsular War to which he does full justice. He was in his early years a most spirited narrator, full of humour, with sometimes a cloud of melancholy crossing the landscape which dwells in the memory. No man could always maintain the high spirits of Charles O'Malley and Harry Lorecker, and Lever turned to tales of a more subdued and ordinary kind. One of them, A Day's Ride, A Life's Romance, considerably lowered the circulation of Dickens's All the Year Round. But it will be in a sad kind of world that Charles O'Malley will die. Edward George Bulwer Lytton, 1803–1873, was, perhaps after Robert Chambers, but far more conspicuously, the most versatile man of letters of his age. He entered Parliament very early, before the passing of the Reform Bill, and already he had impressed Scott by his novel, Pelham. Sir Walter wrote to Lockhart, curious about Pelham and its author. Lockhart replied curtly that Pelham is a puppy, and its author, like Disraeli, certainly aimed at being a dandy, and had a Byronic pose. Perhaps for this reason Thackeray regarded Lytton as a mass of affectations in thought and style, with his pretensions to classical learning and Neoplatonic lore, and mysticism, and his affection for virtuous criminals as in Eugene Aram. Thackeray's burlesque of Lytton, George de Barnwell, was his favorite among his own works, and is a joy forever with its sham history, sham classics, and sham sentiment. When Lytton, in a satire, attacked Tennyson as Miss Alfred, the poet finished the fight in a single round. However, Lytton's novels continued to win admiration, whether they were historical romances. Of these, The Last Days of Pompeii is probably the best of all tales which introduce early Christians, and is still very readable, or whether they were stories of modern life. Zanoni has several times defeated the present writer, but The Caxtons is full of interest. There is no better romance of the supernormal than A Strange Story. And perhaps a kind of sketch for it, The Haunted and the Haunters, is at least as good. The marvels, we may say, are spread too thick, but Lytton manifestly had in his mind the well-authenticated story of Willington Mill. To the last Lytton kept changing his manner and working, with wonderful freshness, in new fields. He missed being in the first rank of novelists, and the bloom is very early off the rye of novelists who fall short of that rank. Of Lockhart's novels, though he tried his hand 4 times, once in the unlucky early Christian period with Valerius, only one is read, Adam Blair, a vigorous and gloomy study of the temptation and fall of a Scottish parish minister. Hogg's Confessions of a Justified Sinner is a most astonishing work, when once it gets under way, anticipating R. L. Stevenson's handling O the Terrible in a Lonely Upland Parish, see Thrawn Janet. But if the story is tardy in its earlier chapters, in the later, it rivals not only Stevenson but Hawthorne, yet few people can be induced to give it a trial. Captain Frederick Marryat, 1792–1848, is a novelist of the days of Nelson's fleet, and nothing is more surprising, nothing in the same field more distressing, than the neglect into which the nautical novels of the creator of Peter Simple, Mr. Midshipman Easy, Masterman Ready, and Snarleyow appear to have fallen. They are full of humor, high spirits, genuine adventures, and sound honest views of life and duty. Carlyle ungratefully called them nonsense, but he read them when under the blow of the destruction of his manuscript of the French Revolution. They are the best sort of boys' books, but the inexplicable taste of boys leads them to prefer the works of Mr. Henty to those which their grandfathers read, the books of Scott, Dumas, Thackeray, Dickens, and Captain Marryat. They were not so fond of Michael Scott's Tom Cringle's Log, and The Cruise of the Midge, but they did read and shudder over Mrs. Shelley's best novel, Frankenstein. Of infinitely more merit than these novelists are the glories of the Victorian period, Dickens, Thackeray, and Charlotte Brontë. Dickens. A star danced and under that was he born might have been the astrological explanation of the genius of Charles Dickens, born at Portsmouth, 1812. Explorers of heredity can find no source of the humor and art of Dickens in his father, Mr. Micawber, a dockyard clerk whose fortunes were never so high as his buoyant hopes, and who was in prisons often for debt. As Mrs. Dickens, the mother, confessedly lent traits to Mrs. Nickleby, we need not look for genius on that side. Dickens's early literary education was mainly derived from some old books which he found in a cupboard. There were The Arabian Nights, for example, and Fielding's novels. He played at being Tom Jones, a child's Tom Jones, an innocent creature, stories of shipwrecks. He went about in fear of savages and determined to sell his life dearly. In fact, there was plenty of good reading. He seems also to have had a nurse who told stories delightfully frightening. We see many traits of his fantastic childish thoughts and dreams in the early Pip of Great Expectations. There are memories, too, in Little Dombey, and in the infancy of David Copperfield. He was, in short, born with an elfish imagination. Always he retained the primitive habit of giving souls and characters to lifeless things. His power of minute observation was precocious, and he was a dreamer of daydreams till the poverty, and negligence, of his family sent him to win his tiny wages and choose his own poor meals, in the service of a warehouse. All this bitter part of his life made him a close observer of poverty, a schemer of expedients, a little man of a child. The improvement of his family's affairs gave him some rather irregular schooling. It was enough to teach him to draw inimitably well the various kinds of schoolboy, except the cruel bully, whom he would have found rampant and abominable at any public school. Like David Copperfield he learned shorthand, was a reporter in Parliament, and conceived a contempt for parliamentary institutions. We all know how he felt when his first magazine article was published. In 1836 papers of his appeared as Sketches by Boz, and in them his peculiar humor, not without debt to Theodore Hook and other well-forgotten comic contemporaries, is already conspicuous. In 1836 he was asked to write papers of the comic and sporting sort, for illustrations of the adventures of a club of citizens. I thought of Mr. Pickwick, he says, and, though Mr. Pickwick did not often run, he ran away with Dickens's fancy as Dougal Dalgetty ran away with Scott's. The peripatetic Socrates of his younger companions, Messrs. Snodgrass, Winkle, fine Tracy Tupman, Mr. Pickwick kept on improving as Vir Pietate Gravis, chivalrous as Don Quixote, adventurous as he, benevolent, and innocent as a child, yet dignified, and to be trifled with by no man or cabman. We remember Mr. Pickwick's idea of an attitude of self-defense. The influence of Smollett is on Dickens as on Fanny Burney. Pickwick is a sequel of Adventures of the Road and of the Inn, filled full of the highest animal spirits. Witness the adventure of the lady with yellow curl papers. Some extraneous stories are placed in the middle of the tale, as by Fielding and Smollett. The book is not a novel, it is something better, it is Pickwick. Already, like Fielding, and with more pertinacity, Dickens was attacking social abuses, imprisonment for debt, the Fleet Prison, the law, as represented by Messrs. Dodson and Fogg and Mr. Justice Stairley. Accidental happy thoughts occurred to him, Mr. Samuel Weller for one, as the tale went on appearing in monthly numbers, and the author was never much ahead of the printer. This mode of publication is responsible for the length and diffuseness of many of the novels both of Dickens and Thackeray. The sheets had to be filled, compression and construction could not be attained. And, in later works, when Dickens did labor hard to construct a plot, we find it, often, as involuted and obscure as the plots of Congreve's comedies. Pickwick was an overwhelming success. Dickens found himself famous and entangled in engagements to produce more concurrent fictions than even Scott could have kept up simultaneously. Yet his high animal spirits and glowing fancy poured themselves out in Nicholas Nickleby, Oliver Twist, The Old Curiosity Shop, Barnaby Rudge, and Martin Chuzzlewit. The American scenes are due to his experiences of the United States between 1838 and 1843. Consider the immense variety, the humor, the crowd of eternally amusing characters, caricatures, if any one pleases, but the most laughable of caricatures. The Squeerses, the Crumlesses, the Dodger, Mrs. Nickleby, Mr. Pecksniff, Bailey Jr., Mrs. Gamp, Mr. Richard Swiveller, the Marchioness, he who loves them not knows them not. The melodramatic and pathetic characters and scenes are less universally admired. Ralph Nickleby, Monk, and Jonas Chuzzlewit rather try our belief, and all the world does not weep over Little Nell. To say, with R. L. Stevenson, that Dickens, in delineating Little Dombey, Tiny Tim, Little Nell, and Dora in David Copperfield, wallowed naked in the pathetic, is to offend many devout admirers. We can take Chaucer's counsel and turn the other page. In David Copperfield, 1849–1850, with the charm of the infancy of David, the pain of his days in the warehouse, with Mr. and Mrs. Micawber, Spenlow and Jorkins, Peggotty, Mr. Dick, Betsy Trotwood, and the rest, Dickens reached, perhaps, the highest mark of his genius. In Bleak House, 1852–1853, despite the Jellabys, and Harold Skimpole, he was too much engaged in the work of reform, and tryst with too difficult a plot, to reach similar success. The plot of Little Dorrit, 1855–1857, is not readily intelligible. The book was disappointing. In A Tale of Two Cities, he won the votes of very many readers who do not care for his lighter works. In Great Expectations, he was himself again, and the plot is the best that he ever constructed. His Pip, from childhood onwards, is a masterpiece. Mr. Wopsle and Mr. Pumblechook are joys forever, and Miss Havisham, though severely criticized, is not, perhaps, untrue to nature, or at least to the actual facts of the case on which Dickens worked. Of Our Mutual Friend, it must be confessed that the plot is difficult. In Dombey and Son, 1846–1848, Dickens appears to have deserted his idea, on an important point, as Scott did in St. Ronan's Well, in deference to the wishes of a friend, and the same change seems to have been made, for a similar reason, in The Fortunes of Estella, in Great Expectations. In Edwin Drood, written in the last year of Dickens's life, 1869–1870, when he was outworn by the feverish energy of his nature, and by the fatigues of travel and of giving readings in hospitable America, Dickens at least left an unsolved puzzle to his students. What was the mystery of Edwin Drood? Did Jasper murder him, or fail to murder him? Some external and some internal evidence favors the idea that Jasper succeeded, but we have seen that Dickens was very capable of relenting at the last moment. In this novel, as in some of his short stories, Dickens shows that leaning to the supernormal, which he usually kept well in hand. So much, indeed, that in his Child's History of England, he treats Jeanne d'Arc as a conceited, hysterical little prig. Dickens had none of the qualities of a historian, and all the contempt of a liberal of his day for the Middle Ages. He was not a man of much bookish knowledge. He was a unique genius presenting, as in a magic mirror, worlds that appeared to himself alone, but that all were rejoiced to see as he saw them. He did not see the world of society, as others see it who live in it. He avoided it, but then what world did he see as other people do? Other worlds he beheld with more sympathy, indeed, but all things presented a kind of fantastic vividness in that enchanted crystal of his imagination. That some of his mannerisms are vexatious is not to be denied, that there are moments of want of balance, of excitement born of fatigue, of breaking into unconscious blank verse. In the great mass of his work is too manifest. In his letters we see the causes and occasions of these defects. But it is ill work, in so brief a sketch, to find faults in the productions of a genius so unique that it has, in our literature, no parallel, and can never be an example. Dickens had imitators, but he could not found a school. He was the only boss. His defects were perfectly visible to the critics of his own day, who did not spare them, but the world did not suffer its pleasure to be darkened by the spots on the sun. We flatter ourselves that Dickens is peculiarly English, and so he is in his idealization of Punch and other creature comforts. Yet he is remarkably popular, even in translations, among the French, and by the Poles he is, among our authors, the most admired. Thackeray. It has been the lot of Thackeray to be constantly pitted against Dickens, like Gray against Collins, and Browning against Tennyson. People have taken sides for one or another, as taste and fancy led, for they were contemporaries, they were novelists, humorists, satirists. But while Dickens, like the minstrel of Odysseus, was self-taught, and was never a man of books, Thackeray, born at Calcutta in 1811, was educated at Charterhouse, and, with Tennyson, at Trinity College, Cambridge, where his career was not unlike that of his Arthur Pendennis, though he took no degree. To Thackeray, Charterhouse was what Christ's Hospital was to Lamb, a constant rather rueful memory. A memory, in Thackeray's case, of fagging, fights, in one he received an honorable scar, of idleness, storytelling, rhyming, caricaturing, and of the classics, stupidly taught. But, like Fielding, he did not forget his classics. His bent was to the art of design. Many of his sketches, though often out of drawing, are very humorous. His Becky Sharp, carrying a coal scuttle, is the actual Becky, and Emmy, in the dance at Pumpernickel, wears the charming face that haunted his pencil. On leaving Cambridge he visited Germany and met Goethe. He lost his patrimony, partly to Mr. Deuceace, partly in the attempt to found a newspaper. In Paris, and in London, after an early marriage, 1836, broken by a lifelong sorrow, Mrs. Thackeray survived him. He wrote for the press, continuing the vein of his scribbling in undergraduate papers like The Snob, and of his comic prize poem, Timbuktu, with its dominant note, Africa for the Africans. I see her sons the hill of glory mount, and sell their sugars on their own account. His Parisian miscellanies in The Paris Sketchbook, 1840, are of varied quality, but are all characteristic. He had found his style, with its harmonies, as in the essay on George Sand, and his British scorn of some French vagaries is offensive to many cosmopolitan minds. Unlike Dickens, he is unpopular in France. He trod the soil with an air of remembering Agincourt and Waterloo. He wrote for The Times, and in Fraser, published the Yellow Plush Papers of that great menial whose Christian names, Charles James, reveal the Stuart mystery, in which his Ma wrapped up his Booth. James was a critic, much too personal, of Bulwer Lytton and Dionysius Lardner, that encyclopedist, and, as a momentary capitalist, as de la Pluche, is a satirist of the age of rapid railway-made fortunes. The simple humours of his spelling recall Smollett's Winifred Jenkins in Humphrey Clinker, while Thackeray's Major Gahagan is a delightful Irish Captain Bobadil. Catherine was a burlesque on the heroes and heroines of novels of virtuous criminals, showing that knowledge of the 18th century which was Thackeray's favourite period. Barry Lyndon, Esmond, the English humorists, Denis Duval. The Four Georges. Thackeray was much inclined to historical studies. I like history, it is so gentlemanly, he said, but a man, not being a professor, cannot live by history alone, and he never finished, probably never began, his contemplated reign of Queen Anne. Everywhere among his early essays and burlesques, his tenderness peeps out, his pathos, his love of children, and of goodness, and his haunting melancholy. These are especially conspicuous in The Shabby Genteel Story, written at a time of great sorrow and struggle with poverty. Barry Lyndon was overlooked despite its masterly ironic study of the vainglorious Irish adventurer of the 18th century. Its pictures, from the gambler's point of view, of Berlin under Frederick the Great, of the little German duchies, of the wild half-ruined Irish gentry. Of the Chevalier de Ballybarry, so perfect as a Catholic, a disillusioned Jacobite, a gentleman, and a swindler. The later adventures of Barry are drawn from Robertson, and the Dowager Lady Strathmore, and their squalid romance. This book, among Thackeray's, corresponds to Fielding's Jonathan Wild, though the irony is broken by the author's comments, which are deemed inartistic. There are moments when Barry's blackguardism breaks down, and he yields to what some may call sentiment, and others, the soul of good in things evil. Nothing so great and nothing more unlike Dickens, had appeared since Fielding's day, but Barry Lyndon passed without a welcome. The Irish Sketchbook, 1843, was the best Irish sketchbook since that of Giraldus Cambrensis, but neither that, nor, From Cornhill to Cairo, 1846, caught this great stupid public by the ears. Mrs. Perkins's Ball, 1847, a Christmas trifle, contains the immortal figure of the Mulligan, to think of whom is to laugh as one writes. He was sketched from a well-known Irishman of the day. The little vignettes of other guests of Mrs. Perkins are worthy of Addison, down to the greengrocer butler. In Punch, Thackeray had been writing and drawing things good and things commonplace. His burlesques of novelists include George de Barnwell, Lytton, which he is said to have thought his masterpiece, and Codlings by Disraeli, which is hardly inferior, but Lever was annoyed by his Phil Fogarty of the Fighting Oneddy Oneeth. Thackeray is the classic parodist, his gift of imitation is as wonderful in the burlesques as in Esmond. Scott, who was privately on the side of Rebecca, in Ivanhoe, and who had deliberately made Rowena very English, would not have been vexed, like Lever, by Thackeray's Rowena and Rebecca, wherein, on false news of Wilfrid's death, the English princess espouses Athelstane. It was the Book of Snobs, with its cruel satire of our British vice, that came home, when republished from Punch, to men's bosoms. Thackeray avowed that demi fabula, that he was a snob himself, and, to some readers, it is matter for regret that he dwelt so long and so intensely on the mean admiration of things mean. He told Motley, 1858, that he could not read the Book of Snobs. At last, in Vanity Fair, which appeared, like Dickens's novels, in monthly parts, with yellow covers, Thackeray, after so many vain endeavors, took this great stupid public by the ears. Here was another epic, like Tom Jones, of English life, from the year preceding Waterloo, though the Marquis of Stein was too closely studied from a contemporary wicked marquis. From the first chapter, the scene of Becky with the dictionary, to the end where, quite out of character, say Becky's admirers, she appears as a melodramatic Clytemnestra, the author never stoops his wing. Never, surely, did man create, in a single novel, characters so many, so varied, so justly conceived, so immortal. Fielding has not a quarter of Thackeray's variousness, does not see so wide a vision of life. Think of them. All the Crawleys, the two Sir Pitts, Rawdon, Amo Rawdon, Jim Crawley, Miss Crawley, the old patrician Whig and skeptic, the two Osbornes, the little boys, Osborne 3. And little Rawdon, Mrs. O'Dowd, the sponging housekeeper, Mr. Wenham, Ensign Stubble, Lord Stein, the Misses Pinkerton, Briggs, Waterloo Sedley, the Belgian courier, Glorvina, the Lady Bareacres, the catalogue is endless. Dobbin is as good as that honest gentleman can be made. We can only say that Thackeray's good women are not at once as human and as angelic as Fielding's Sophia and Amelia. Emmy is not clever, Emmy can be jealous, a vice from which Mrs. Rawdon Crawley is nobly free. The nearest woman to Sophia in Thackeray is Theo in The Virginians. But Sophia is a paragon. Thackeray was now, by no fault of his, set up as the rival of Dickens, whose works he constantly praised, in season and out of season, in public and in private. But as every man is born an Aristotelian or a Platonist, a Whig or a Tory, so men are born to take one side or other about the great twin brethren of English fiction, in place of admiring and enjoying both. Each has his masterpieces, Dickens with Pickwick, David Copperfield, and Great Expectations, Thackeray with Vanity Fair, Esmond, The Newcomes, and Pendennis. That admirable but lengthy picture of the life of school, of the university, literature, and society, and of Mr. Henry Fokker, bears traces, in discrepancies and fatigue, of a severe illness which affected the author's memory of part of the tale, as a malady swept from Scott's the whole of The Bride of Lammermoor. The noble tour de force of Esmond, 1852, was, for the most part, dictated in disturbing conditions, which makes yet greater the marvel of its style of Queen Anne's date. Not uniform, to be sure, not all antique, any more than Colonel Esmond's political views are all antique or uniform, but still, a kind of prodigy. Beatrix Esmond is indeed, as her lover said, a paragon, and it is historically impossible that, in the end, she should have betrayed the blameless king, King James III. Whom Thackeray converted from a melancholy quietist into a witty and profligate prince. There was no Queen Oglethorpe. Scott never took this kind of liberty with an historical character, in fiction. And Thackeray rivaled Scott's other licenses by making the Duke of Hamilton an unmarried man. But nobody thinks of these things when Esmond admits him into the society of the Augustan age, and when Bolingbroke hiccups about Jonathan's readiness to command the fleet. The Newcomes, 1855, revived the public taste for Thackeray. The public did not, it is said, quite understand Esmond. Like all novels published in parts throughout 2 years, The Newcomes is too long, and has its languors, but every one wept over the good colonel, loathed the campaigner, delighted in Fred Bayham, wished to beat Barnes Newcome on the nose. Was afraid of Lady Kew. Sighed with Clive, was more or less in love with Ethel, and was anxious, vainly anxious, to see no more of Laura Pendennis, an angel perhaps, but a recording angel. At Rome, in winter, 1853, Thackeray, to amuse some children, wrote The Rose and the Ring, a classic of the nursery, of the schoolroom, and of the grown-up. He who writes was a child in 1855, and to him Bulbo, Hedzoff, King Valoroso, and the Countess Gruffanuff, with the usual contrasted heroines, Angelica and Rosalba, were not dearer then than they are now. Even then the equation was plain. Angelica Rosalba. Fair and, Becky Emmy, dark and. False, Blanche Amory Laura, true and. Rowena Rebecca, tender. Thackeray's naughty women are fair and false, his good women are dark, and true, and tender. The novelist's is a dreadful trade. He has to raise ever new crops from soil more or less exhausted. Dickens had his Dombey, his Little Dorrit, his mutual friend, and Thackeray had his Virginians, the grandsons of Colonel Esmond, with their kinswoman, Beatrix Esmond, fallen into an old age of cards, and rouge and powder. Beatrix, for her beauty's sake, should have been translated, like the fairest woman of the ancient world, Helen, to the plain Elysian. We do not want to see her in old age, or to hear her last wild words, Mesdames, je suis la reine, the Queen. The Virginians is full of excellent things, wonderful studies of the later 18th century. And Harry is a deal, brave, stupid lad, and George is a sardonic, melancholy descendant of Colonel Esmond, an ancestor of Stunner Warrington, in Pendennis, and Will Esmond and Chaplain Sampson are worthy of Fielding, but the author was tired. After Vanity Fair he was always tired, and the book has barren expanses and languors. The Virginians, he said to Motley, is devilish stupid, but at the same time most admirable. Thackeray's health was worn out. As a change of work he founded, but soon wearied of editing, the Cornhill magazine, was at his lowest level in Lovell the Widower. Was so weary in Philip that he styled the hero Clive by inadvertence, though he endowed his clumsy Philip with one of his best women, Charlotte. He ventured into melodrama, which he liked, but could not write well. Yet his roundabout papers show that he was, as an essayist, equal to his younger self. His Denis Duval seemed to promise a return of his genius, but Christmas Day, 1863, was a black Christmas, for the author had died, suddenly and alone, in the night of Christmas Eve. He had a great faculty of enjoyment, a generous heart sorely tried, a melancholy that was not causeless, immense kindness and love of the young, in short the character, in these respects, of Molière and of Charles Lamb. Let us confess that he was unjust to Becky Sharp and Beatrix Esmond. But he had a Shakespearean tenderness for his rogues, and having conceived the draconic design of hanging Colonel Altamont, he respite that bold adventurer. From boyhood he had his own originality of style. In the cultivated town of Highbury, my father kept a circulating library. Our boyish lines of his, and we recognize him even there, beginning to be what he is in his Book of Ballads, so various, so merry, so melancholy, so fresh as they are. Though the influences of the prose of Queen Anne and of Fielding help to form his style, it is entirely his own, with the blended accents of his own humor and pathos, and harmonies before unheard, exquisite passages of verbal music. The Brontë Sisters. Concerning the Brontë sisters much, mainly personal, has been written, in proportion to the amount of their works. Their novels, especially those of Charlotte, Jane Eyre, Shirley, Villette, the Professor, seem like the extraordinary and almost automatic products of their parentage and surroundings. The father, the Rev. Patrick Prunty or Brontë, was an Irish Protestant of County Down, who, after struggles with circumstances, was educated at St. John's College, Cambridge, and took holy orders. His Protestantism and politics were those of an Orangeman. His hero, who could have a better, was the Duke of Wellington, and he was addicted to the composition of verse. His wife, a Cornish woman, was of feeble health, and died after giving birth to 6 children, 2 of whom, Maria and Elizabeth, died in early youth. the others were Charlotte, 1816, Branwell, 1817, Emily, 1818, and Anne, 1820. On the mother's death the father lived a sequestered studious life in a bleak parsonage on the Yorkshire moors, and the children were entirely devoted to drawing, reading books and magazines meant for their elders, to writing, daydreaming, and to wandering from the grim rectory over the open moors. Their health was blighted by the conditions of the school called Lowood in Jane Eyre. Their tempers were hardened and sharpened by poverty and the white slave's life of the governess, so much dreaded and so well understood by Miss Austen's Jane Fairfax in Emma. The unhappy Branwell, in the end, haunted the rectory, an awful presence of intellect degraded, and while Emily wrapped herself up in a kind of Christian stoicism, Charlotte was left to the contrast between the dreams of her fiery genius and the facts of her narrow life. In 1842 Charlotte and Emily became inmates of the school of Monsieur and Madame Heger at Brussels, which later afforded to Charlotte the scene and two characters in Villette. In 1846 the three sisters published Poems, by Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. Of this book 2 copies were sold. Of the poems Emily's alone are still admired for their somber energy and resolute spirit. The sisters now wrote novels, Emily, Wuthering Heights, Charlotte, The Professor, Anne, Agnes Grey. In August, 1846, Charlotte began Jane Eyre, which, when finished, came into the hands of Thackeray's publishers, Messrs. Smith and Elder, and filled them with amazement and enthusiasm. The book appeared in autumn, 1847, pleased Lockhart, then editor of The Quarterly Review, no less than it pleased Mr. Smith, and at once became the daughter of debate, discussed everywhere, praised and reviled, and, in some unintelligible way, most reviled by The Quarterly. The critic detected in the author an unregenerate, violent rebel against society, and a woman who was a dishonor to her sex. Certainly. A wounded human spirit turns here on its bed of pain. The unparalleled vigor and genius of the early scenes, the cruelties which the lonely child supports with unconquered spirit, were things new in fiction. While the repressed passion of the plain yet seductive governess during the wooing of the too Byronic Mr. Rochester, and in a house as terrible as the castle of Mrs. Radcliffe's Sicilian romance, excited a lively romantic interest, accompanied by a tendency to smile at an ignorant imagination. Borrowed romance combined with instinctive realism, bitter experience blended with the daydreams of a life, a frankness long forgotten by early Victorian fiction, made the novel a strange and triumphantly successful combination. That mentor of young novelists, George Lewes, recommended to the author the study of Miss Austen, whose novels Charlotte Brontë was not happy enough, because she never had been happy, to appreciate. That she had no humor we cannot say, but she had none of the kindly humor of her great predecessor. Meanwhile, Wuthering Heights, that strange and strenuous study of violent characters, was eclipsed by Jane Eyre, though it has now come to its own, thanks to the appreciations of Mr. Matthew Arnold and Mr. Swinburne. The author did not live to find herself famous, and Brontë also died, leaving their sister in deeper solitude. Charlotte's Shirley, 1849, with its caricatures of the local curates, caused the discovery of her authorship. The curates were forgiving, and the novel was welcomed. Miss Brontë visited London, a shy and tameless lioness, and met Thackeray, whom she had regarded as a Saul among the prophets, and discovered to be something rather different. Her shyness permitted her to rebuke him in good set terms, but blighted his guests. Her last novel, Villette, 1852, with romantic situations, is a record of her personal experiences at Brussels. Unfortunate for her hosts, and a cause of much gossip and personal discussion. The book is not destitute of the hungry bitterness which Matthew Arnold detected and disliked, and we ask how in the nature of things it could be otherwise. Her experience had been narrow, atrocious, and on her experience and from her experience she always drew when she did not borrow from her daydreams. In life she did not find the love of which she dreamed. In 1854, she had rejected several other suitors. She married the Reverend Mr. Nichols, her father's curate, and died in the following year. Her life, her character, and her books were one, and were unique. This little Jean d'Arc, as Thackeray called her, this eager rebel and ardent Tory, broke into the placidity of the contemporary novel, and opened a pathway unto many, who had little or none of her genius. The best estimate of the Brontes, clear of and contemptuous of trivialities and gossip, is in French, Les Sœurs Brontë, by the Abbé Dimner. Nathaniel Hawthorne. The end of all that Greeks and Trojans suffered for Helen's sake was, that there might be a song in the ears of men of after times. In the view of the interests of art, and in no other, the end of Puritanism in New England was to inspire the novels of Nathaniel Hawthorne, 1804–1864. He was more certainly the classical author of American fiction than either Thackeray or Dickens is in England. They were prodigal of their genius, giving, as rich men give who care not for their gifts, or, if you please, as poor men when the printer's devil is at the door, even as did Sir Walter, who never thought about art. But Hawthorne hoarded his inspirations, and when he used them gave them in the best form which was within his means. The inspiration was always moral, and usually bizarre. In his published notebooks we see his method. He conceived some strange situations, over some of these he brooded till the characters disengaged themselves and lived before his eyes, and worked out their wird under stress of sin and remorse. He thought of the effect of a sudden homicidal act on a character gay, innocent, and fawn-like, and we have Donatello in The Marble Faun, or Transformation. He thought of the amour of a Puritan preacher, like Lockhart in Adam Blair, and the idea grew into The Scarlet Letter. He thought of the beautiful poisonous girl, an old legend, and we have Rappaccini's Daughter. The Puritan sense of sin, and the old New England sorrows of the witchcraft trials, and the shadows of the woods, and the fear of the Indians, among whom Meikle John Gibb, a Covenanter who went too far even for the Reverend Mr. Cargill, was a great medicine man, dwelt in his imagination. He felt acutely, though not a man of religion, the horrors of the Jean Van Creed, which did not make the people who believed in it more unhappy than their Episcopalian neighbors. They were accustomed to the doctrines which horrified Hawthorne's contemporaries in America, and, like the Black Laird of Ormistown, hanged for Darnley's murder, and richly deserving to be hanged for his daily misdeeds. They saw their way out of a doom of eternal fire which Hawthorne supposed them always to anticipate. Nervousness had not set in, the climate had not produced its effect on the sturdy Puritans of New England. By Hawthorne's time the climate had produced its effect, and he brooded blackly over what his ancestors should have felt, but did not feel. The Black Laird of Ormistown had only to convince himself that he was of the elect, as he did, and death, to him, meant, as he said, that he should sup that night in paradise. Not understanding this buoyancy of temperament, Hawthorne dwelt on the horrors which he supposed his ancestors to have fed full of, and, in his stories, expressed his emotions in terms of imperishable art. Though he had no theological basis he remained a Puritan. He, to whom beauty was everything, talked of the squeamish love of beauty. In Europe he is said, like an excellent pope who had tin aprons made for the classic nude figures of Greco-Roman sculpture, to have been horrified by the innocent nudities of ancient art. They had never seen anything so improper at Salem, Massachusetts, a decaying seaport where he was born, and lived for 14 years after taking his degree at Bowdoin in 1825. Here he wrote short tales with little acceptance. And he did not till 1849 to 1854, publish his best-known novels, The Scarlet Letter, The House of the Seven Gables, and, result of a stay at a peaceful and purely amateur socialist settlement, Brook Farm, The Blithedale Romance. His Tanglewood Tales, from Greek myths, in which Hermes is called Quicksilver, at first repel, for obvious reasons, but, in fact and on reflection, have much charm. And with Kingsley's, the heroes, ought not to be neglected by parents and guardians, but rather, placed in the hands, of children. Though some amateurs may prefer The House of the Seven Gables, haunted as it is by the blood which chokes the justice, and a little enlivened by the dusty humor of Hepzibah, a decayed gentlewoman, and pervaded by the pretty charm of Phoebe. The Scarlet Letter is probably Hawthorne's masterpiece. It may be, and has been, denied by specialists that the hectic and craven Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale could possibly have been the father of the elf-like child Pearl, but these are oppositions of science, falsely so called. Hester's avenging husband may be, in conception, Dickens-like, but the treatment is far from suggesting Dickens, while The Passion of Hester is a masterpiece of poetical fiction. Knots may be sought and found in any read of fictitious narrative, but The Scarlet Letter remains, in its human characters and its dim lights, in its purposeful limitations, and hints at something unrevealed. A masterpiece of romance written under classical conditions. The Marble Faun, the plot and mystery were suggested by the murder, by a French duke, of his wife. Miriam is the British governess in that unholy affair, has noble moments and passages, and unconsciously reveals what his notebooks publicly avow, that Hawthorne was terribly ill at ease in Europe, and among monuments of classic and medieval art. He had some scruple about enjoying them, they were not at all American, and he was rather bitterly patriotic, one might almost say parochial, in certain moods. But he had lived for most of his life in Salem, Massachusetts. He had, for several years, been American consul at Liverpool. He was a genius of the most exquisite nature, and no more is needed to explain some acerbities and some misappreciations, while we can all sympathize with his criticisms of the adiposity of some British matrons. Oliver Wendell Holmes. What has been said about Longfellow may be whispered about Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was at once poet, essayist, and novelist. Both authors should be read first while the reader is young, and can enjoy their books with the freshness of an unsophisticated taste. This is not true of the very great things in literature. In these with advancing experience we ever find new merits, while in studying some early favorites we can scarcely recapture our original delight. Holmes was born in the same year as Edgar Allan Poe, 1809, at Cambridge in New England, where his father was Orthodox minister of the First Church. This appears to mean that he was a Calvinist, while Harvard, where the son was educated, was devoted to the Unitarian Creed, of which the articles are, to the writer, unknown. Holmes accepted them. Medicine was his profession, he held for some time a chair of anatomy. In Boston, where he lived for the greater part of his life, he practiced for some time, but his productions in verse and prose gradually caused him to occupy himself mainly with letters. In 1831 he first produced part of his Autocrat of the Breakfast Table, monologues with rare interruptions from the fellow guests of a pension. In 1857 he returned to this pleasant form of discursive essays, the other guests breaking in occasionally according to their ages and characters. Hitherto Holmes had been best known for occasional verses, especially verses written for the Phi Beta Kappa Society of his university, and for college anniversaries. The one-hoss shay is, in England, with The Nautilus, the best known of these social feats. In his discursive essays he frequently breaks a lance with his old enemy, Calvinistic theology. This is not very exhilarating. At least to readers who never learned, or if they learned never attached any meaning to the shorter catechism. Holmes, who, to be sure, had a minister as his tutor, and Hawthorne, appear to have understood the doctrines, which were useful to Holmes as a butt, and to Hawthorne as a background in his novels, gloomy and alarming. The ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir. Naturally Holmes found the sciences to which he was bred very useful in supplying anecdotes and illustrations to his essays and romances. In Elsie Venner, the heroine, on good Calvinistic principles, is of the seed of the serpent, and inherits its nature, owing to some mishap of her mother with a rattlesnake. Whether this be scientifically conceivable or not, Elsie is, by inheritance, a perfectly original young woman in an ordinary environment of New England. We do not expect to meet Melusine so far from Lusignan. In The Guardian Angel, the heroine has several complex personalities, derived from different ancestors, one of them a Red Indian. These devices are in Hawthorne's manner of fantastic invention, without Hawthorne's grasp and power, but the heroines are surrounded by characters more humorous and natural than Hawthorne's people, and the stories are extremely good reading. As are the discursive essays. There is abundance of knowledge of the world, of wit, of humor, and of kind good humor. There is plenty of strange lore from old books of mystic medicine, and Holmes confessed to being a little superstitious. Near the house of his boyhood there were devil's footsteps in a field, and a house from which a portion of the wall had been carried away from within outward. The marks were associated with a story of a diabolical apparition at a hell-fire club, just as at Brasenose College, Oxford. The terrors of his childhood left their mark on his books. There was the faintest touch of Cotton Mather in this foe of Cotton's creed, which, out of fashion or not, was the nurse of many virtues inherited by its tireless opponent. His enduring fame rests on his Autocrat and other essays. No man in England, said Thackeray in 1858, can write with his charming mixture of wit, pathos, and imagination. Charles Kingsley. Charles Kingsley, 1819–1875, was a novelist, by way of bywork, and had intellect and energy which might have found for themselves other fields. Born 30 years earlier he might have distinguished himself under Wellington or Nelson. But in piping times of peace, after living the life of an athlete, sportsman, and reading man at Magdalene, Cambridge, he took holy orders, as Colonel Gardiner might have done, had he been earlier converted. As rector of Eversley in Hampshire, he was an energetic parish priest, and had opportunities of angling for those uneducated trout which he commemorates in his pleasant, chalk stream studies, for he was a born naturalist and observer of nature. The agitation among the laboring classes in the times of the Chartists awakened him to social questions and Christian socialism, but as the excitement of the populace lulled, his interest slackened. The fruits of it were the novels of Yeast and Alton Locke, 1848, 1850, which well deserve to be read, and repay the reader. It is almost incredible that Cambridge crews, in Kingsley's day, rode in the May week after wine parties and much eating of ices. But the sympathy with sweated artisans and the delineation of rural scenes and sports, are fiery, forcible, and sincere, whatever the truth may be about Cambridge training at that distant date. In 1853 he produced Hypatia, a romance of the pagan girl philosopher, torn to pieces by the Christian mob of Alexandria. The advent of Goths who cut up these beasts is a welcome relief, but the Jew who attempts humorous philosophy is merely a proof of Kingsley's lack of humor and an example of his characteristically strenuous efforts to be humorous. The book is, indeed, a boy's book, and has something in it, Kingsley's preoccupation with sexual ethics, which is not so agreeable to reflective seniors. Somewhat of this, with an aggressive Protestantism, and the sin of jockeying wide difficulty, mar the otherwise delightful romance of Westward Ho. The adventures of Amyas Leigh on the Spanish Main and in tropical forests in the great days of Elizabethan adventure. Kingsley hates and execrates the Spaniards. We have ourselves exterminated some savage peoples, and nearly exterminated others, and have no right to throw the first stone at the Spanish conquerors in America, odious beyond words as their dealings with Aztecs and Incas were. While the Privy Council, under Cecil, could give points in cruelty to the Spanish Inquisition of the day. But the boy who reads, or ought to read, Westward Ho, has none of these chilling reflections, nor had Kingsley. Taking the facts as Kingsley saw them, in the old English way, the novel is a superlatively excellent romance of English virtue and valor, and there is no doubt as to the valor and the adventurers had no doubts as to their own virtues. The whole is the work of a poet, for a poet Kingsley was, and of a patriot, sympathizing with Drake's England in the crucial trial whence she emerged a victor. Where are the galleons of Spain? 2 years ago, a novel of the Crimean War, must take its chances with the historical facts. And, in Hereward the Wake, the bloodthirsty hero, despite the glory of his final fight, which rivals that of the brave Bussy or of Grettir the Strong in the saga, in places awakes the smile even of the reflective schoolboy, to whom however it may be recommended. The Water Babies is not always defective in humor, and would be excellent as a tale for children were it not for satire directed at the parents of the period. The heroes initiate the young into the glories of the romance of minions and Minoans, and can only be spoken of by those who read it in early boyhood with entire gratitude and the remembrance of delight. Indeed, no one who has read Kingsley after the age of 16 is a fair critic of an author who, like R. L. Stevenson, was always at heart a boy. To appreciate him we must put away grown-up things. While, as to his verse, his songs and ballads, in Andromeda, 1858, and even his hexameters, deserve immortality. He was not fitted for the chair of history at Cambridge. Froude thinks that Kingsley's a divine. And Kingsley goes to Froude for history, said the poet. His controversy with Cardinal Newman brought him into contact with a prettier fighter, and he did not come up to time against the author of the Apologia. His essays, especially that on the Puritan aversion to the Caroline drama, are vigorous, and well worth reading. The brother of Charles Kingsley, Henry, 1830–1876, either wanted leisure or lacked care and constructive faculty, but in his earlier works he displayed high spirits, and kind humor, with a good deal of skill in drawing character, and an engaging reckless manner. His most careful book, Geoffrey Hamlin, though promising, is not so dear to its readers as Ravenshoe, a delightful topsy-turvy romance. The children in Henry Kingsley's books are especially fascinating. Here we may briefly advert to two writers who with remarkable originality of character and outlook as novelists appeal to but small but devoted audiences. Thomas Love Peacock, 1785–1866, was an almost self-made classical scholar, and a friend of Shelley's. His contributions to Shelley's biography are those of a rather candid though intensely admiring friend. His novels, from the early Headlong Hall and Melancourt, and Nightmare Abbey, to Gryll Grange, at the end of his career, are not so much romances as discursive and satirical studies of, and dialogues about, contemporary society, opinion, and taste. Some of the characters are drawn, in part, from real personages, for example, from Shelley himself. The wit which Shelley called so keen, occasionally yields place to somewhat florid burlesque. The interest of Peacock is partly that which we feel in his own character and satiric views of life, partly it is historical. George Borrow, 1803–1881, a Norfolk man, who in childhood had followed his father's regiment as Sterne had done, can be best estimated by a study of his Lavengro, really a sort of autobiography. Here he paints himself as a genius in the study of many languages, a friend of gypsies and their fellow wanderer, an expert in the art of boxing, and altogether as a character equally vigorous and eccentric, and a sturdy Low Churchman who hates papists, snobs, and Sir Walter Scott. Whether on the moors with the viper-catcher, or at horse fairs with jockeys and thimble-riggers, or as the hack of a niggardly publisher, or fighting the flaming tinman under the eyes of the lovely but unconvincing Isapel burners, Borrow is always the strong, wild, tameless heroic figure. As an agent for the Bible Society in Spain he was in a place which suited his genius, and his The Bible in Spain is at least as romantic as evangelical. The Romany Rye is of the same fantastically autobiographical form as Lavengro, brilliantly capricious and picturesque. Other books are The Gypsies in Spain, and Wild Wales. Borrow plumed himself much on his wide range of philological learning, from Welsh to Manchu, but the strict modern science does not regard him as a very great scholar. There are dull stagnant places in his books, and there are passages aflame with genius. Mrs. Oliphant, Mary Margaret Wilson, 1828–1897, was a woman of letters who heroically undertook incessant labor for the sake of others who were dependent on her pen. Consequently her gifts were diluted, and she must always be best known for the novels styled The Chronicles of Carlingford, which are remarkable for their placid unstrained humor. More than once she displayed a very unusual power of dealing with the supernatural, especially in A Beleaguered City, and Old Lady Mary. In these pieces her manner is unique for tenderness and sympathy. In her historical biographies, as of Molière and Jeanne d'Arc, she suffered from want of strict training, and if she found a good thing of apocryphal source, inserted it on its literary merits. Her work on the publishing House of Blackwood is valuable to the student of literature and literary lives in the days of Wilson and Lockhart. Few who have written so much have written so well. Wilkie Collins, 1824–1889, a close associate of Dickens, was an assiduous professional novelist, who strenuously did his best and achieved 2 or 3 immense popular successes. His main strength lay in the construction of plots which powerfully excited curiosity, as in The Woman in White, No Name, and The Moonstone. The former was apparently suggested by the mystery of a French law suit, which dragged on from before the Revolution to the reign of Louis Philippe. The central puzzle, a question of identity, never was solved. Collins did his best to create characters, as well as to tell stories, but his humor was labored. Captain Rag is his chief success, and he shared with Dickens the mannerism of constantly dwelling on the tricks and hobbies of his people. For a long and warm appreciation of Collins, Mr. Swinburne's essay may be consulted. The work of his later years and overtasked fancy, such as Poor Miss Finch and The Haunted Hotel, may be neglected. Some of his short stories are good. Popular novelists were Major White Melville, best in Tales of Sport and the Affections, but ranging all fields from ancient Assyria to The Queen's Maries. George Lawrence, the author of That Joy of Boyhood, Guy Livingstone, Sword and Gown, and other tales military and sporting. He was the intellectual father of Ouida, Miss de la Ramée, with her magnificent guardsmen, and innocent descriptions of racing and of field sports. She was for long very prolific and very popular. She lashed the vices of society, and was the constant friend of animals. Gorgeous is the epithet that may be applied to her style, and humor did not enter into her genius, which may be called heroic in the manner of the 17th-century tragedies. James Payn, on the other hand, had almost too much humor for the purposes of a novelist, accompanied by the most delightful high spirits. These would have interfered with the success of his novels, from Lost Sir Massingberd onwards, in which he provided the public with highly wrought melodramas, the style of the serious characters being heroic in a high degree. Had the public perceived that he was laughing in his sleeve. But his domestic sentiment, and his spirited heroes and heroines, carried the serious reader on, while light-hearted readers were convulsed with laughter. His best novels proper are perhaps By Proxy, and Halves. He was one of the best and kindest of men, and most hospitable, as editor of The Cornhill Magazine, to the work of younger authors, such as Mr. Stanley Weyman and R. L. Stevenson. The John Inglesant of Mr. Shorthouse, a dignified and thoughtful novel of the Great Rebellion, which had a resonant success, Mr. Payn declined when it came before him in manuscript. He also took no pleasure in the works of Aeschylus. George Meredith. George Meredith, novelist and poet, was, in his literary fortunes, a somewhat mysterious power, a somewhat thwarted force. His early novels, the comic Oriental tale of The Shaving of Shagpat, The Ordeal of Richard Feverel, Evan Harrington, Rhoda Fleming, were full of humor, wit, pathos, the charm of love's young dream. Were peopled by delightful heroines, whose heroes were appropriate, brave, and not too staid. Rose Jocelyn, Lucy, the Countess, the dark Rhoda Fleming, the beautiful hapless Dahlia. Certainly very young readers in those old days of the early 60s were in love with them, thought the aphorisms of The Pilgrim's Scrip the acme of witty wisdom. Rejoiced in Mrs. Barry as in the nurse of Julia, delighted in the hypochondriac hippie, and in Adrian, the wise young man, nearly shed tears over Claire Doria Fowey, who let concealment, like the wormite the bud, feed on her damask cheek. Admired the glorious Mel, laughed sympathetically over Algernon, the young fool, and his Derby Day, and generally were a most favorable public. But the general public was unfavorable. Meredith's Evan Harrington nearly ruined, once a week, even aided by Charles Keane's designs it was a failure, and the editor had to call in Shirley Brooks, with The Silver Cord, which no man remembereth, perhaps, except him who writes. Those early novels were not obscure, even to the reading boy, the wit was net too subtle and alembicated, or too profuse. The humor was English, beer and cricket were provided, there was pathos, comedy, character in abundance, but the novels did not appeal to that happy reading public which had still Thackeray and Dickens. And George Eliot for the thoughtful, and Miss Braddon, in the full flush of her early genius, for all who liked a plain tale well told, a humorous melodrama, such as The Doctor's Wife, or While Mrs. Henry Wood poured forth romances that deans and princes and everybody could appreciate. It is said to be a fact that Her Majesty Queen Victoria took pleasure in Mrs. Wood's novels. And it is quite certain that another lady, believed by many to be the great-granddaughter of Charles III, better known as Prince Charlie, shared the royal taste. Possibly this competition caused Meredith's grace to be hid. Possibly, curious as it may seem, he was best appreciated by readers in extreme youth. This is probably the truth, for, in much later years, the writer has seen quite unaffected young girls absorbed in The Egoist or Diana of the Crossways, while he, after gallant efforts, was defeated by both in a very early round. Tripped up on every page by the leg of Sir Wilfrid, the Egoist. Too much seemed to be made of that limb. But with The Egoist, which is doubtless a triumph in wit and knowledge of human nature, as such it was rapturously hailed by R.L. Stevenson, Meredith's fortunes turned. The enthusiasm of young critics at last communicated itself to the more cultured public, and to the public which wished to seem cultured, a lucrative circle. It was like the success of Mr. Browning, which came so many years after Men and Women. People then turned back on Meredith's early novels, and discovered the manifold virtues which had been overlooked by contemporaries. They who had been boys in the 60s might think that by the 80s an over-excessive straining after wit and epigram, and a subtlety which was too near neighbor to obscurity, with a mannerism of style too precious and too easily imitable, had overtaken the master. The truth may be that age had dulled the wits of these critics, that they had lost wit and zest. To them the English prose of One of Our Conquerors seemed darkling and decadent, and in The Amazing Marriage the baby was the most astonishing element. Whether they were in the right or in the wrong, the admiration of Meredith, like the admiration of Fitzgerald's Omar Khayyam, had become, not only a cult, it had already, as in Omar's case, been a cult with the few. But a cult with mysteries open to what Coleridge did not love, the reading public. Be it as it may, the master came to his own, as a novelist who to wit, fancy, humor, and power of creating characters, added the still rarer qualities of a true though decidedly difficult poet. Anthony Trollope. The pace is too good, in the world of novel writing and of novel readers, to inquire deeply into the characteristics of the genius of Anthony Trollope, who was born in the year of Waterloo, held a place in the post office, pursued the fox. Knew much of many sides of life in London, and much of a cathedral town, but did not make a great impression on public taste till, in 1855, he began his series of tales of Barchester. The Bishop, Dr. Proudie, his termagant wife, his chaplain, his Archdeacon Grantley, with the loves and marriages of their children, and the ecclesiastical politics of the age, were the Farrago libelli. Trollope had a good deal of humour. His heroines, Lily Dale and Lucy Robartes and the rest were, in various degrees, nice girls. His political characters and dukes were of their date. He was extremely fluent. And he stamped his own ideas of his art and of the true method of composition on his brief life of Thackeray. 50. People who have read Trollope will probably bear witness that many of his characters live in memory, and are friendly inmates of her cell. This can scarcely be said of the characters of Lytton, for example, and in his power of creating characters Trollope comes before any novelist of his own rank, and of his now neglected age. It would be easy to write a long catalogue of Trollope's memorable people, mainly, but by no means solely, dwellers in Barchester. The Grantleys, the Proudies, Bertie Stanhope and his sister, the last of the Neros, the Crawleys, not of Queen's Crawley, Adolphus Crosby, Johnny Eames, Amelia Roper, Planty Pal, so justly driven back to the path of virtue by Griselda, Mr. Slope, these are only a few of his creations. With this creative gift, Trollope, though not refined, or daring, or emancipated, or passionate, has a claim to be remembered. And the right readers will still find in his works abundance of entertainment. George Eliot. In 1857, Blackwood's Magazine, always notable for discovering good new hands, began to publish Scenes from Clerical Life, which at once attracted notice by their humor, tenderness, and quiet accomplished style. Were they by a man or a woman? Dickens voted that George Eliot was a woman. He was right. She was Miss Marian Evans, born in Warwickshire in 1819. Familiar from childhood with the rural characters whom she drew so admirably, perhaps this art was her true forte. In other fields her humour was inconspicuous or absent. She went to London, associated with advanced philosophers, such as Mr. Herbert Spencer, changed her theological views and made her home with George Henry Lewes, author of a Life of Goethe, and of a surprising History of Philosophy. He was a married man, separated from his wife with no chance of a divorce, and he was the constant mentor of the new novelist, though his own essays in the art of fiction were absolute failures. In 1859 George Eliot made a very great success with Adam Bede, which, to the merits of her Scenes from Clerical Life, added a plot and a story of a not heartless seducer who fights and is knocked out of time by a hardy carpenter, his rival. The hero. The little victim, Hetty, is like a more heartless Effie Deans, and her crime, not committed by poor Effie, caused many sympathetic tears. The Jeannie Deans of the story is a female preacher, with considerable strength of character. The Mill on the Floss, which followed, is excellent in the humorous parts, and the heroine, Maggie Tulliver, is delightful as a child, less interesting when she falls in love with a distasteful admirer. Silas Marner, a much shorter is perhaps a still better tale, and marks the central period of the author's genius. In Romola, 1863, a story of the Florentine Renaissance, the author was out of the environment which she knew, and was thought to be too moral and didactic. In Middlemarch her heroes were, to men, distasteful, and they preferred her pretty to her noble heroine, while Mr. Casaubon, of the Key to All Mythologies, was held to be too closely studied from the life. Daniel Deronda was very long, and a kind of scientific jargon had been taking the place of the old rustic humours. Moreover, people felt that they were being preached at, and Mr. Swinburne, contrasting Charlotte Brontë with George Eliot, helped to turn the tide from worship of the living to adoration of the dead woman of genius. George Eliot, Mrs. Cross after Lewis's death, and her own marriage to Mr. Cross in 1880, wrote no more than a book of reflections, the opinions of Theophrastus such. She died in 1880. Culture, which had exaggerated her merits, began unjustly to disparage them. To understand the injustice it is only necessary to read her books written before Romola. There has been no better novelist since the death of Dickens. Robert Louis Stevenson. To Robert Louis Stevenson, 1850–1894, no one who found his works were sympathetic will deny the title of a man of genius. It is unnecessary to dwell on the details of his life. The essence of them is to be gathered from his own essays and from his published correspondence. From his earliest childhood his health was so unstable that he appeared to live on his astonishing intellectual and moral energy rather than on his physical basis. His education was casual and frequently interrupted by recurrent maladies. From childhood a dreamer of dreams and teller of tales, he educated himself, by study of great models mainly in Old French and English, in the formation of style and the choice of words. His contributions to magazines, essays and short stories, revealed the last successor of the school of Lamb and Hazlitt, a scholar with a philosophy of life of his own. The Philosophy of Youth, see the essays collected and published in Virginibus Puerisque, 1881, and Familiar Studies of Men and Books, 1882. At the same time such brief tales of his as A Lodging for the Night, and The Sire de Maletroit's Door, and Thrawn Janet, in periodicals, proved him to be a master of romance, and a master with a thorough understanding of historical characters. Surroundings, superstition, and the power of communicating the ancestral thrill of superstition. His interest in history was intense and sympathetic, and was even a danger in his path, as he would willingly have engaged himself in that unpopular study. But he was, as Jonson told Boswell that he was, longer a boy than other people, and in 1878 he wrote for an obscure periodical, The New Arabian Nights, a fantasy of humor and of perilous adventure. In a spirit of mockery, like his own Young Man with the Cream Tarts. In 1881, in a boy's paper, he wrote Treasure Island, a story meant for boys, but delightful to a critic so little apt to notice his juniors as Mr. Matthew Arnold. Prince Otto, 1885, is a court romance of the 18th century, full of brilliant passages, but confessedly written and rewritten again and again under the influence of George Meredith. In 1886, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a fantasy not uninfluenced, perhaps, by Edgar Poe, but rich in his own philosophy, humor, and style, at last captured public attention, caused a new shudder, and was rapturously welcomed as a moral allegory from the pulpits of all denominations. The story, or at least the mechanism of the story, came, like Kubla Khan, to the author in a dream. What is probably his best novel, without a woman in it, Kidnapped, was suggested by his studies of Highland history after 1745. It was planned on a much larger scale, but now, as sometimes occurred, the pen simply dropped from the author's hand, in one of his many maladies. Such studies of Highland and Lowland character as he gave in Kidnapped, though the evil uncle is, in his own phrase, too steep, are only equalled or excelled in those of Sir Walter Scott. While the pictures of Highland and Lowland life and society at a period, just after Culloden, untouched by Scott, are historically accurate. The same period is again viewed in that bitter study of almost insane fraternal hatred, The Master of Ballantrae, 1889, supposed to be narrated by a loyal servitor who is also a constitutional coward. There is little relief in this romance except that which comes from one of Prince Charles's Irish officers, the inimitable Chevalier Burke. In 1893 appeared Catriona, the sequel to Kidnapped, in which, for the first time except in the exotic Prince Otto, and in a short story, The Pavilion on the Links, Stevenson introduced the love interest, and drew an admirably chivalrous and amiable heroine, Catriona herself, with her even more attractive foil, the daring and dominating Barbara Grant. Alan Breck in this sequel is worthy of himself in Kidnapped, and James Moore MacGregor is a masterly historical portrait. The Wrong Box, 1889, is a humorous fantasy somewhat in the manner of The New Arabian Nights, with many scenes which provoke laughter unquenchable. The Wrecker, 1892, is rich in reminiscences of the author's youth in Paris and of Fontainebleau, and the plot, up to a certain point, strongly excites curiosity, but, despite the brilliance of some oceanic adventures, the story is not well constructed, and is rather disappointing. The Ebb Tide, 1894, was spoken of by the author as his blooming failure, for his colloquial style was not classical. 51 St. Ives, 1897, left unfinished, and completed by Sir Arthur Quiller Couch, shows signs of fatigue, but the fragment of Weir of Hermiston, in which his foot is on his native heath, gave all promise of a masterpiece in its many delineations of character. In all his work, in whatever kind, the charm of his style accompanied the reader like the murmur of a burn that runs by the wayside. Of his verses, A Child's Garden of Verses, 1885, is the most like himself. A few of his serious poems in English have noble effects, but perhaps the best of his poems in the Lowland vernacular are to be preferred. His plays, written in collaboration with Mr. W. E. Henley, were too literary, or for some other reason were unsuccessful on the stage, Deacon Brodie, Beau Austin, Admiral Guinea. When we consider the great variety of Stevenson's works, their wide range, their tenderness, their sympathy, their mastery of terror and pity, their gloom and their gaiety. When we remember that his sympathy and knowledge are as conspicuous in his tales of the brown natives of the Pacific, the beach of Falesa, as of Highlanders and Lowlanders, and the French of the 15th century, we can have little doubt concerning his place in literature. Minor novelists. Among other novelists not hitherto named, the author of Charlotte Bronte's biography, Mrs. Gaskell, née Stevenson, was born at Chelsea, but lived and married in Manchester, and in 1848 rendered the life of a manufacturing population, with their strikes and grimy lives, then a new theme for fiction, in her story of Mary Barton, 1848. Her Cranford, 1853, in a very different field, pictures the placid existence of maiden ladies in a quiet village. Her Sylvia's Lovers, North and South, and her delightful unfinished, Wives and Daughters, 1866, the author died in 1865, all deservedly hold their place among the classics of our fiction. With them, A Little Clan would place novels unjustly forgotten, The School for Fathers, by Talbot Gwynne, and The Initials, by the Baroness Tautphoeus. Charles Reade, 1814–1884, was a very prominent and emphatic character of his age, a kind of Lawrence Boythorn, engaged in fiction and the drama. He was a Fellow of Magdalen, Oxford, a barrister who did not practice, a philanthropist, some of whose novels had a purpose, a combatant whose lance was ever in rest, and as kind and generous as he was pugnacious. For a thoroughly appreciative study of Reade, a characteristic essay by Mr. Swinburne should be read. His Never Too Late to Mend, a study, very painful, of the torture of prisoners in jails, and a much more pleasant picture of adventurous life in Australia, Jackie, the Black Fellow, is a Jewel, was most successful, 1856. And some reckon The Cloister and the Hearth, a moving romance of latest medieval life in Germany and Italy, a masterpiece of historical fiction. The tone is perhaps too modern and certainly too robustious. Peg Woffington, 1852, is perhaps really better as a historical tale. Griffith Gaunt and A Terrible Temptation, with Foul Play, and The Wandering Heir, the claimant in the great Annesley case of 1743, have but few to praise them. And the last mentioned is too manifestly made up of the materials in the never-decided law case. Itself stranger than fiction, but destitute of a single sympathetic character. Space affords room for no more than a grateful mention of Mr. William Black, whose pictures of Scottish characters, sport, and landscape gave much pleasure to his contemporaries. And of Sir Walter Besant, whose gift of humour in character and incident was combined, on occasion, with a singular power of fantasy, while his Dorothy Forster, A Tale of the Rising of 1715, is probably the best historical romance of that period after Rob Roy. XXXVI, Historians. After the appearance of the works of Hume and Robertson, history became, as we have heard Gibbon say, the most popular theme with the reading public. His own monumental work gave new impetus to historical study. Sharon Turner, 1768–1847, devoted himself mainly to Anglo-Saxon researches. Sir Francis Palgrave, 1788–1861, distinguished himself by research into the institutions and events of England and of English history from the Conquest to the days of the Plantagenets. Dr. Lingard, a Catholic priest, 1771–1851, produced a general history of the country up to 1688, which perhaps has not yet been superseded by any book of similar scope. And which is the more valuable as indicating the aspect of events in the eyes of a Catholic. Necessarily the works of these authors lack much information, contained in manuscripts not then accessible to them, but now open to students by the better arrangement and cataloguing of state papers. The historians of the end of the 18th and the first 30 or 40 years of the 19th century, were not so heavily laden with documents as historical writers of today. And they had leisure enough to assimilate their less ponderous materials and to arrange them with more of reflection and of art than is now common. The historian who wears best is decidedly Henry Hallam, 1777–1859. The son of a canon of Windsor, he was educated at Eton and Christ Church. He entered the Middle Temple, but obtained a fairly lucrative post in the civil service, had property of his own, and devoted himself, in his leisure, to literary and historical study. His view of the state of Europe during the Middle Ages holds its ground, despite the absence of materials now made common coin by Stubbs, Maitland, and others. Considering the immensity of the ground which Hallam surveys, his accuracy is remarkable. For example, he corrects, all in vain, an important if minute error of detail which still infests the latest works on Jeanne d'Arc, and though he is compelled to be concise, we see in his pages, for instance on Charlemagne, that he can combine spirit and interest with brevity. The same praise must be given to his Constitutional History of England, Henry VII. George II. It is commonly said that an impartial historian cannot be interesting. On the other hand, Hallam's conscientious efforts to be impartial lend much interest to his books. He has no flights of impetuous rhetoric, he is the last man to let his imagination transfigure prosaic facts into glittering fancies. We see an honorable, learned, and sober-minded man, who sums up life like a judge and does not plead like an advocate. Eulogy and invective may be had for the asking. But for cold rigid justice, the one weight and the one measure, we know not where else to look. Says Macaulay in his review of Hallam's book, a review even unusually rich in the unmeasured invective of the more popular historian. If we think Hallam dull, the dullness is in ourselves. Hallam has not the current delusion that the Protestant reformers, from 1550 to 1688, were friends of freedom of conscience. His last important book, An Introduction to the Literature of Europe, 15th to 17th centuries, is very deficient in taste for the early works of less primitives. We cannot place the Iliad on a level with the Jerusalem of Tasso, in some essential respects. On the other hand, Hallam speaks thus of Christopher North, Professor Wilson, a living writer of the most ardent and enthusiastic genius, whose eloquence is as the rush of mighty waters, with more to the same effect. Spenser's stanza is particularly inconvenient and languid in narration. Hallam has, in fact, very little space for inspiriting literary criticism, on account of the vast scope of his theme. He has to treat of Scioppius, his Infamia Famiani, and of Ubbo Emmius, of Grevius and Spanheim, Camerarius and Grew. The encyclopedic nature of Hallam's task made it impossible for him to avoid aridity, and to mingle much pleasure with instruction. He is otherwise associated with poetry, as his son Arthur was the friend of Tennyson, and dying early, inspired the long elegy of In Memoriam, and the beautiful lines on The Valley of Cauterets. Thomas Babington Macaulay. Thomas Babington Macaulay, born at Rothley Temple in Leicestershire, on October 25, 1800, is an ideal representative of one mood of the English mind and character during the first half of the 19th century. Though the Mac in his patronymic be Gaelic, he and his forefathers had little in them of the typical Celt. The name Macaulay means Mac Olaf, Olafson, and the Norseman rather than the Celt predominated in Macaulay. His great-grandfather, the Rev. Ole, and his grandfather the Reverend John, are reported by Bishop Forbes, in The Lion in Mourning, to have been personally and peculiarly active in attempting to gain the prize of £30,000 offered by the English government for Prince Charles. Their enterprise did not suit the Celtic character. Macaulay's father, Zachary, was a deeply religious man, a member of the so-called Clapham sect of evangelicals. Though he was at one time prosperous in business, so much of his time and energy were given to Negro emancipation that misfortunes came, and Macaulay had to work hard for his livelihood. There are no more delightful chapters in biography than those in which Sir George Trevelyan describes Macaulay's childhood. His intelligence was precocious, his memory was a marvel. At the age of 9 he read once through The Lay of the Last Minstrel, and was able to repeat the whole of the poem. This exceeds even Scott's feat of repeating the whole of a ballad of 80 verses which he had heard read once by the author. Macaulay's memory lasted throughout his life, and gave him, naturally, that amazing readiness and richness in literary and historical allusions which have made his essays in history popular beyond rivalry. No doubt like Scott he relied on memory too confidently, styling Claverhouse, for example, James Graham. He read with a rapidity inconceivable. And he read everything, from Plato, Herodotus, and Aeschylus to the worst novels, forgetting nothing in them that was accidentally good or exquisitely absurd. Even in childhood he was a copious and accomplished writer. His family epic on Olaf, King and Saint, presents a remarkably successful imitation of Scott's style in The Lady of the Lake. With these intellectual gifts he combined intense affection, good humor, and a turn for loud and vehement argument. Going from a private school to Trinity College, Cambridge, Macaulay regretted that he had not chosen Oxford. For mathematics were his abomination. He twice gained, as Tennyson did once, the Chancellor's Medal for a prize poem, but in the Tripos of 1822 Macaulay of Trinity was gulfed by the cross-grained muses of the cube and square. They did not prevent him from obtaining a fellowship at Trinity. He won a prize essay on William III, which is written in the very cadences of style that mark his history, and, at intervals, in the same short sentences. He knew where to pause. He outraged no national prejudice. He abolished no ancient form. He altered no venerable name. Possibly it is a pity that these sentences do not describe William's conduct in Scottish affairs. His early pieces, Macaulay contributed to Knight's Quarterly magazine. At the age of 25 he wrote in The Edinburgh Review, that essay on poetry in general and on Milton as poet, man, and politician in particular, which took the world as suddenly and as completely as Byron's Childe Harold had done. The family breakfast table was covered with cards of invitation to dinner from every quarter of London. To readers who in our day read the essay this enthusiasm seems creditable to the world, but rather surprising. Of Aeschylus, Macaulay wrote, "Considered as plays, his works are absurd, considered as choruses, they are above all praise." Milton's admiration of Euripides reminds him of Titania kissing the long ears of Bottom. Grateful as every reader is to Macaulay for the vivid and lucid expression of his knowledge and thought in his essays, we must admit that, like Charles Lamb, he was a man of imperfect sympathies. Miss Edgeworth, delighted to find her own name in a footnote to his History of England, expressed to him her regret that Scott, who had written with entire impartiality about Macaulay's period, was not once mentioned. In truth, after reading Lockhart's Life of Scott, with its magnificent and melancholy close in the journal of a man working himself to death for honour's sake, Macaulay wrote thus of Sir Walter, in politics a bitter and unscrupulous partisan. Profuse and ostentatious in expense, agitated by the hopes and fears of a gambler, sacrificing the perfection of his compositions to his eagerness for money. In order to satisfy wants which were produced by his extravagant waste or rapacious speculations, this is the way in which he appears to me. Scott was a Tory, and from Macaulay's remarks we understand the justice of his studies of historical characters. The rapacious speculator, in fact, had shown extravagant waste in publishing books, not his own, of disinterested research. When he was ruined he gave away his work, because he had not money to give. The bitter and unscrupulous partisan, as a historian of his country, was more than scrupulously fair. Of Brougham's essays Macaulay wrote, "All the characters are either too black or too fair." The passions of the writer do not suffer him even to maintain the decent appearance of impartiality. These are the very charges brought against Macaulay's own characters of William Penn the Quaker, and Claverhouse the Cavalier, while no historian, perhaps, can defend his account of Sir Elijah Impey. Had a Stuart king behaved as William III did in the matter of the Darien enterprise, we can easily imagine the style in which Macaulay would have dusted the varlet's jacket. But with lapse of time his bias, his prejudices, can be discounted. As early as 1828 he wrote, "A perfect historian must possess an imagination sufficiently powerful to make his narrative affecting and picturesque." That power of imagination he possessed and exercised so delightfully that his history was at once purchased more eagerly than a poem or romance. Both as a collector of materials and as a traveller to the scenes of which he was to write, Macaulay toiled with his own unexampled energy in rapidity. It is well worth while to read his account of his own methods both in study and in composition. 52. It is not the good fortune of most historians to possess even Macaulay's private means, the savings of 5 years passed in India as legal member of the Indian Council. Nor can his practical knowledge of politics and of the world be often found among students, while his natural gifts of imagination and of expression are almost unexampled. His intellect had the limits of his class, his age, and his robust and hasty temperament. His poems, the lays of ancient Rome, have been as popular as his prose. He tried at 40 to write such ballads as he conceived the folk songs of Republican Rome to have been, and nobody can deny that the lays have abundance of spirit and go. The Ballad of the Armada, and of The Last Buccaneer, possess the same virtues and will always be dear to young people of spirit. Arrived at the age of 50, Macaulay wrote, in the very words of the dying Hazlitt, "Well, I have had a happy life. It was extended to 1859, he died on December 28, leaving a name justly honorable and a cherished memory. Thomas Carlyle. Carlyle, 1795 to 1881, with Burns, Knox, and Scott, is the chief representative in letters of the good and the not so good, in his own words applied to Sir Walter, of the Scottish character. Unlike the other three, Carlyle was thrawn, a word not easily translated, but implying a certain twist, or perversion, towards the whole nature of things. The apostle of silence was the most voluble of mortals. The peasant stoic felt the pain of the pea beneath a heap of mattresses as keenly as the delicate princess of the fairy tale. Carlyle was first of all a Scottish humorist. That peculiar humour of which sovereigns deny the existence underlay the fateful gloom of the philosopher and historian who beheld his country shooting Niagara, who saw that society was rotten and doomed, and who found no remedy except in the arrival of a Cromwell or a Frederick. He praised the keen and scrupulous force of such heroes, though he did not use the term Superman. He believed in the idea. It is quite certain that he had great tenderness and friendliness. His affection for Lockhart, so unlike him superficially, though Lockhart, too, was tender, melancholy, and thrawn, is really touching. Carlyle had our Scottish kindness, in Knox's phrase, that is attachment to kin and clan. Even in his dourest moods of personal invective his bark was worse than his bite, but there was a great deal of bark. The conclusion of the whole matter in the long dispute as to the relations of Carlyle and Mrs. Carlyle is that, with a deep mutual affection, theirs was a life of cat and dog. Born in 1795 at Ecclefechan in Dumfriesshire, Carlyle was the son of a stone mason, though his genealogy traces him back behind the Conquest to the Carlisle lords of Torthorwald. Educated at the Grammar School of Annan, and the University of Edinburgh, Carlyle was for some years a dominie, much at odds with himself and the universe. He found guidance in Goethe and other Germans. Wrote in Fraser's Magazine, and elsewhere, essays often historical. In London met Coleridge and Lamb, who was in one of his wildest moods, wrote a Life of Schiller, in the style of a man of this world. Married in 1826, and for 6 years was brooding, grumbling, studying, writing, and making himself, in the bitter solitude of his wife's little lairdship, Craigengputtock. Here he produced, in his own characteristic manner, Sartor Resartus, a disguised autobiography, a humorous and mournful version of his own struggles to find bottom in a universe apparently bottomless. That most things are shams, and that shams are doomed, was Carlyle's message. The fate of shams was illustrated in the fiery pages of his French Revolution, written after he went to his lifelong home in Cheyne Walk, Chelsea, where it could not be said that, as in Kilmeny's Fairyland, the cock never crew. When, despite cocks and other disturbances, Carlyle, with heroic efforts of study, had finished the first volume, John Stuart Mill lent it to a lady, and it was never seen again. Her cook may have been a Betty Barnes. Carlyle returned to his task, and in 1837 the book astonished the world. It had all the color of romance, and despite the discoveries of recent research, it seems substantially accurate in detail. Heroes and hero worship, and the past, medieval, and present, prelude to his very laborious Letters and Speeches of Oliver Cromwell, 1845. With many a groan over the confusion of his materials, and with many a shout of applause to the orator of the speeches, Carlyle set Oliver in the light of day. Interpreting the studied ambiguities of such speeches of the hero as he makes to the puzzled Wildrake in Woodstock. Sir Walter's Cromwell is probably as correct a portrait of the Protector as Carlyle's, and Carlyle's must be compared with the less enthusiastic study by Mr. S. R. Gardiner. Carlyle took conscientious pains with the military part of his history, visiting the battlefields, and becoming epic in the fiery spirit of his description of the defeat of his countrymen at Dunbar. A chart picture of the battle evaded his research, and his account is not absolutely correct. After another prophetic cry of doom in Latter-day Pamphlets, 1850, Carlyle plunged for many years into the labor of studying Frederick the Great. The toil outwore his force, and it may be complained that he did not focus his subject. Yet none of his books is of greater interest, and he is the prophet of the modern greatness of Germany. We see how fortis Etruria crevit. Through discipline, patriotism, self-sacrifice, enduring hardness, and obedient to her greatest men. No other than Carlyle could have told the story with so much alluring animation. His military history, too, is most conscientiously studied. His native gift of observing, divining, and describing, in his own words on a singularly private scene, witnessed by him, with perhaps some humorous exaggeration, found ample scope in his work on Frederick, as well as in his French Revolution. No doubt he overdid the trick of reiterating traits in Dickens's manner. For a truly candid censure of his style, an essay by his obliged friend, Leigh Hunt, may be consulted. See remarks on Leigh Hunt. Occasionally, as in his essays on Cagliostro and The Diamond Necklace, Carlyle's freedom of style, and his attacks on his authorities, are somewhat infuriating. The reader wants to be told a plain tale without these excursions, exclamations, and imaginations. Carlyle regarded imagination as one of the wings of history, and perhaps encouraged the too freely imaginative narrations of his friend Froude. To him, unhappily, he bequeathed the autobiographical papers of himself and his wife, which Froude handled, to the best of his power, as he understood that Carlyle had desired that they should be treated. There followed outcries from the more ferocious admirers of Carlyle, though Froude had done his best to obey his master. That he could not be absolutely accurate is certain, but disloyal he never was. There is no doubt that Carlyle, irritable, absorbed in his work, and taking his wife's exemplary care of him for granted, was guile to live while she had a tongue with a tang. These facts have produced a jungle of deplorable writings. But of Carlyle's genuine goodness and kindness no one who saw him could reasonably doubt. The style of Carlyle was unique, unimaginable except by himself, the worst of models for others, and exquisitely fitted to embody his own idiosyncrasies. In short, it is, in prose, not wholly unlike that of Browning in many of his poems. To address the world in this voice, when he was almost unknown, demanded a courage and confidence in which Carlyle was not deficient. One is occasionally reminded of the methods, illegitimate but effective, of the author of Tristram Shandy, and, again, of Rabelais. James Anthony Froude. In one way, as a historian, Froude, 1818–1894, may be called the pupil, as he was the devoted friend, of Carlyle. That sage worshipped force in men, and Froude, failing a Cromwell or a Frederick, made a hero of Henry VIII. That blot of blood and grease on the pages of English history, as Dickens called the king who found the gospel light in Bullen's eyes. It is not from Carlyle that a young historian can learn the unpopular grace of impartiality. To read Froude you would suppose that the Protestant party in the 16th century were innocent of the blood shed by political assassins. Whereas the godly slayers of Beaton, Riccio, and the Duc de Guise, like Elizabeth when she bade Powlett murder Mary Stuart, were precisely on a level with the would-be murderers of Elizabeth, and Henry VIII was burning martyrs of all shades in England, while the Beatons were doing the same thing to heretics in Scotland. Henry was perhaps even more treacherous than he was lustful and cruel, but it is in the original sources, not in Froude's history, that you discover the fact. However, impartial history is notoriously dull, whereas that of Froude is so entertaining that to take up a volume is to go on reading, fascinated by his charm, and delighted by a style remote as the poles from Carlyle's. It is as simple as Swift's, admirably lucid, excelling in the gift of narrative, without imitable peculiarities, and as entirely spontaneous as if the author were writing an ordinary letter. Froude, with his brother Richard, was at Oxford when Newman was the great influence among the junior fellows. Exeter was Froude's college, and Froude went so far with the movement as to work at the lives of some early English saints. But the innocent legends of their miracles were too much for his belief, despite the excellent evidence for some of those of St. Thomas of Canterbury. His skepticism extended, and his short anti-religious novel, The Nemesis of Faith, 1849, is said to have been thrown into the fire by a don of his own college. He turned to history, that of England from the reign of Henry VIII to the defeat of the Armada, and he resolutely attacked the great masses of Spanish contemporary manuscripts at Simancas. It was a knightly deed, when we think of the handwriting of the period, and the sometimes inextricably bad grammar of the writers. Different modern historians, in one case, give diverse translations of one crucial passage, and it seems that all of them are wrong. But Froude committed many errors which were not perceived by his furious assailant, Freeman, who did not know where to have him, but are conspicuous when we compare his work with his authorities. He is quite untrustworthy. He has taken fragments from 3 letters of 3 different dates, and printed them, with marks of quotation, as if they occurred in a single letter. He accuses Mary Stuart of a certain action, on the authority of the English ambassador, and when we read his letter we find him saying that rumor charges Mary with the fact, but that he does not believe it. Froude describes a dramatic scene in which Elizabeth triumphs over the Scottish envoys sent to plead for Mary's life, and when we examine the authorities, to which an erroneous reference is given, we find in them no such matter, no such scene. The impression given is that Froude read his authorities, let what he read simmer in his mind, let his fancy play freely over it, and then wrote in picturesque and alluring fashion, on the dictates of romance, without ever comparing what he wrote with what his authorities recorded. They are uninteresting. Froude is extremely interesting. As a maker of literature he is in the first rank, as a chronicler of the truth he is not always trustworthy. He did not know his subject, all round. Of Scotland he knew little, and was wedded to the belief that James I was the first of the Stuart line. He gravely repeats and embellishes Knox's mythical account of the disaster of Solway Moss, but probably the English dispatches of the day were not accessible to him. How much of the interest of his book would survive if it were reduced to the sober verities one cannot estimate, but his wonderful power of giving a kind of bird's-eye views of most complicated European situations in politics must remain unmatched. Froude, against his bias, made it seem almost certain that Elizabeth had guilty foreknowledge of the death of Amy Robsart. He leaned on a letter of the Spanish ambassador, and reading the Spanish for last month as the present month, he left an erroneous impression. At the moment, 1856 to 1869, there seems to have been no English reviewer who had the necessary knowledge, for Freeman merely picked holes in the fringes of Froude's work. Froude wrote The English in Ireland, wrote books of political observations made in our colonies, and, succeeding Freeman as professor of modern history at Oxford, lectured on Erasmus and published his lectures, which were flown upon by the critics. He also wrote a good Life of Bunyan, and a longer biography of Caesar. His short studies are as interesting as his history, which is not likely to be superseded. As a literary view of a great period of history, it has no rival. It is as rich in original research as in portraits of characters. All that it lacks is a final comparison of the results with the authorities. Edward Augustus Freeman. Freeman, 1823 to 1892, will always be best known by his long History of the Norman Conquest, a work which embraces most of our island story before the great event of 1066. The author, a Fellow of Trinity, Oxford, was also a squire in Somerset, and could afford to devote his time to a gentlemanly but usually unremunerative form of literature. His work is protracted, minute, and influenced by a passion for the ideal English in the national character. Prodigiously industrious in his study of the original sources in print, he had a kind of dislike of research in manuscripts. He was well versed in architecture, topography, and local history. He was as much at home in Sicily as in England, with Greco-Roman as with Norman remains. He was combative, and, in an earlier age, would probably have invited Mr. Robertson to settle the question of the English overlordship of Scotland in the lists. His great work is more profitable to the serious student than interesting to the general reader. He wrote much in The Saturday Review, without adding to the popularity of that periodical. He was constantly correcting the errors of others, and died during a controversy with Mr. Horace Round on the existence or non-existence of a palisade at the Battle of Hastings, or Senlac. His friend and pupil, J.R. Green, 1837 to 1883, is celebrated for his Short History of the English People, 1874, a work written in a style rather acro-Corinthian, and in its first edition rich in errors, later corrected. The book is written with so much spirit and sympathy that it may tempt many a reader to go more deeply into books less popular. Green had the power of exciting interest in topics generally deemed arid, and, with Freeman, contributed to the success of the history school at Oxford, though even more was due to the work of Bishop Stubbs on charters and constitutional history. And to the tutorial lectures and influence of the late Bishop of London, Mandell Creighton, author of A History of the Popes. William Hickling Prescott. William Hickling Prescott, 1796–1859, the celebrated historian of the two greatest adventures of the modern world, was born, like Hawthorne, at Salem, and was educated at Harvard. Here some student threw a piece of bread at him in hall, his eye was struck, and his sight was so much injured that he could only write by aid of a kind of framework with cross lines. While his reading, whether from books or manuscripts, was almost wholly done by proxy. The works were read aloud, he listened. Probably had notes made of the passages which he meant to use in his histories, composed his periods and then dictated them to a copyist. His Ferdinand and Isabella, The History of Spain in Her Glory, is of 1837. 6 years later he published The Conquest of Mexico, 1843, The Conquest of Peru, in 1847, and, up till his death in 1859, he was at work on the first decadence of Spain, under Philip II. In glancing over the list of historical writers in English, from Gibbon downwards, we remark that almost all were men who could afford to deal with a theme so generally unpopular as the past. Hume and Robertson and Gibbon were all, when they worked at history, men in possession of a competence, or more than a competence. So was Hallam, so was Sir Walter Scott. Grote, Prescott, Freeman, Macaulay, were at least equally fortunate, while Carlyle, by dint of the strictest economy, was at least able to wait for years before reaping the emoluments of his labors. The man of letters who must live by his pen must live by hack work of various kinds, and cannot afford the time to collect and digest his information, to select the little ore from the quarry of documents, and then present in an artistic form the result of his researches. Professors of history who must employ their days by lecturing to and correcting the essays of pupils, live from the altar of history, but are almost never great and are never popular historians. The chief American and English historical writers of 1840 to 1890 were fortunate in another way, of which Prescott took full advantage. They might dare to be interesting, to describe striking events with what eloquence they had at command, and venture to dwell on the characters and fortunes of historical persons, famous or obscure. Science, through the lips of 100 professors, did not then insist that historical writers must be dry, impersonal, impartial weighers of anise and cumin, students of economics. Scores of unread specialists were not lying in wait to pounce upon every slip, and blot out every touch of color. Indeed, Mr. Froude could, and did, go as he pleased, and his most unfriendly critics did not know the period of which he wrote. Nobody, like Mr. Gardiner later, gave a whole year of study to the documents of a single year. Now accuracy is a precious thing, but historians who live in constant fear of making a slip have not hitherto produced books which stand high as literature, books which are read for human pleasure. Again, in the last golden age of history which was literature, the reading public, always a minute minority, was not wholly absorbed in new novels. Thus the historians of that time had many advantages, and they were men who deserved their opportunities. Once more, when Prescott set to work, the states of Europe at last began to permit men of letters to make free use of their collections of old public documents, letters, dispatches, books of accounts. While the Royal Academy of History at Madrid gave the greatest facilities to the assistance of Prescott, a favor denied, in the 18th century, to Dr. Robertson. The president of the Academy placed his own fine collection of documents at the disposal of the American historian, as did Sir Thomas Phillips in England, and the archives of Mexico were open to him, while he read, of course, through the remarkable book composed, after the conquest, from the evidence of the learned Aztecs, by Sahagan, and the delightful chronicle of one of the conquerors, Bernal Diaz. New materials may since have come to light, but Prescott, rejoicing in the rich mine of true romance. Writing with zest and spirit and wide erudition, produced his 2 books on the 2 great adventures of Cortez and Pizarro in such a form that his works cannot be superseded. It is said by an American critic that the imperial palaces which he saw in an imagination kindled by that of the Spanish conquerors have dwindled to large communal houses inhabited by barbarians. And that he lived too early to make use of the results of archaeological research. But anyone who looks at the scanty relics of ancient Anahuac in the British Museum knows what kind of barbarians produced such objects of art. Moreover, the Spaniards came from a land of palaces, the land of the Alhambra, and of glorious cathedrals. It is not possible to believe that they were deceived, and described Aztec buildings as palaces, while they were merely long houses like those of the Iroquois. This appears to the writer to be a vain imagination, and the works of Prescott, though romantic, are not romances. John Lothrop Motley. The chief historical writers of the United States occur in a group, between the years of Macaulay and Froude. One of the most popular, and deservedly popular, is John Lothrop Motley, 1814 to 1877. He chose neither American nor English history for his theme, but, in selecting the Dutch Republic, found a topic exciting to Republicans in one country and to Protestants and friends of freedom's cause in both. Motley, who was born near Boston, had a father of substantial wealth who liked literature. He went to Harvard, and then studied at Berlin and Göttingen, where he became the friend of the great Bismarck. Like Macaulay, Hallam, and others, he spent his leisure in the most intellectual society, whether abroad or in America, and in constant touch with men of literary genius, Lowell, Holmes, Longfellow, Thackeray. And also with diplomatists occupied with national affairs. He was not a student and recluse, who can scarcely ever be a historian, in the literary sense, however serviceable he may be as an archivist, a collector and critic of the materials of history. Motley, returning to America, tried to write novels, without success, then chose his subject, for years toiled at the massive printed books of the Dutch, and for some 4 years worked at manuscript documents in Holland, Belgium, and elsewhere. Between 1851 and 1856 he accomplished his task, the rise of the Dutch Republic. The firm of Murray declined to embark in it, and might rue their caution, for, once published, the book was received with acclaim, both by critics, including Mr. Froude, and by the purchasing public, who found it as interesting as a novel. The Saturday Review, then in the academic and educated arrogance of its youth, was unfriendly. Perhaps partly because the author was an American, partly because of his Protestant enthusiasm. Prescott, who was working at the same period, and generously welcomed the enterprise of the younger man, told Motley that he had whittled away Philip II, and that he saw the events through Dutch spectacles. But these were popular spectacles. And few persons know the Spanish and Catholic side of the shield. Dutch critics, while they praised, made their reserves. And an old feud reawoke when, later, Motley wrote on the Arminian, not the Calvinist side of the great party quarrel in Holland, and on the career of John Barnevelt. As a diplomatist, in 1869 American minister in England, Motley knew the nature of the inmost political councils, he knew European society. He had, in much the same measure as Froude, the art of making the dry bones of the past clothe themselves in flesh and blood, in steel armor, or in satins and velvets. He had access to many dispatches, often in cipher, always in the hardest of all handwritings, that of the 16th century before the Roman hand was adopted, and he labored at these with iron endurance. Turning his results to favor and to prettiness, by the graces of his pictorial style. His continuation of his work, The History of the United Netherlands, published by Mr. Murray, was completed in 1865, his Life of John of Barnevelt in 1874. He died in England, 1877, and there is buried. His work has not been, and for English readers is never likely to be, superseded, though it would gain by addition of notes from eminent Dutch critical historians. He was of a beautiful presence, and, according to Lady Byron, had a most wonderful likeness to the poet. His letters are full of amusing gossip about the world of Thackeray and Macaulay. Other historians. Sir William Napier, 1785–1860, who fought with distinction under Wellington in the Peninsula, combined with his great personal knowledge of the war conscientious research in documents, and a style of the most brilliant eloquence. Impartial he was not, and he had the fiery temper of the Napiers, but modern research, as in Mr. Oman's great work, now corrects him, and now complements his information. The great work of George Grote, 1794–1871, a radical in politics, a banker by profession, is The History of Greece. It is too well known to need description. Though Grote's aim was to set Athenian democracy in what he held to be its true light, he labored not less assiduously among the mythic legends and the heroic poetry of Hellas. He was most erudite in every fragment of Greek records, and his work, though destitute of much new light recently discovered by excavations of Greek sites and from inscriptions, yet holds its place, unsurpassed, as a general history of Hellas. Henry Hart Milman, 1791–1868, was educated at Eton and Brasenose College, Oxford, and began his literary career as a writer of verse. The poet-priest Milman, so ready to kill man, is thus mentioned by Byron, who thought that Milman had attacked him, or Shelley, or both, in The Quarterly Review. He later wrote The History of the Jews, now out of date, and his chief and very meritorious work, The History of Latin Christianity, 1855. Space, and the nature of his subjects, logical, philosophical, political, and social, forbid more than a mention of a man so prominent and influential as John Stuart Mill, 1806–1873. Mill was privately educated and forced into precocity by his father, James Mill, a liberal doctrinaire. In 1843 he gave to the world his System of Logic, in 1848 his Political Economy. The former, at least, was for many years read almost as much as the Ethics of Aristotle by competitors for honours at Oxford. His Liberty, 1859, was an extremely advanced book in its day, as was his Subjection of Women. Mill sowed large handfuls of the seed of the dragon's teeth. He was an earnest, precise, and lucid writer, but not successful in Parliament. Newman. The bearers of some of the greatest literary names of the 19th century produced books which had vast influence on the development of thought, and yet left little work that, as mere literature, is of the highest merit. They were concerned with the religious, theological, social, and political ideas of their own time, which, like all the ideas personal, as it were, to one or two generations, could not remain fixed, but glided into protean forms of change. Thus John Henry Newman, born in London, 1801, educated at Trinity College, Oxford, Fellow of Oriel, 1822, passed through various phases of religious and ecclesiastical belief. Was a leader with Pusey, Keble, and many others in the Oxford Anglican movement, found that his reason led him into the Roman fold, he was made a cardinal finally, and wrote voluminously, and in a style confessedly of the highest merit. Yet no doubt his most widely and permanently interesting work took the form of a defensive autobiography, Apologia pro vita sua, 1864, which is more read for its vivid study of his own mental vicissitudes, and personal experiences, than for its theological science. It answers, in his generation, to the Confessions of St. Augustine. Newman describes himself as not only religious but superstitious in boyhood. He read Law's Serious Call, and crossed himself when he went into the dark. His search for truth was earnest, his nature was almost skeptical but hospitable towards the marvelous, and his own party, to whatsoever party he belonged at any period, never knew where or how far his theory of the development of doctrine would carry him. As a tutor of Oriel, and vicar of St. Mary's, he exercised, as much by his personality and sanctity of life as by his intellect, an unprecedented influence over the minds of the young. In 1843–4 he began to publish Lives of the English Saints from the earliest period. Many of these were done by Newman's disciples. The narratives abound in miracles of all sorts which proved too much for the faith of J. Froude. Newman's doctrine developed in a way which puzzled himself and others. His heart and his tastes drew him towards Catholicism, his earlier ideas caused him to preach against the old faith. At last his reason sided with his secret longing love of Rome. His Tract 90, in Tracts for the Times, alarmed the academic authorities. I hardly knew where I stood. When I wanted to be in peace and silence I had to speak out, and I incurred the charge of weakness from some men, and of mysteriousness, shuffling, and underhand dealing from the majority. He retired from the university pulpit, and after a period of retreat and reflection, crossed the Rubicon. There was a long and bitter period of trials, of broken friendships, of charges of duplicity and so forth. In reviewing Froude's History, Charles Kingsley spoke as if more than doubtful of Newman's respect for truth as such. A correspondence followed. Kingsley wrote an offensive pamphlet. What then does Dr. Newman mean? Newman, by this time a man of 63, answered the question in his Apologia, first making a terrible display of acute personal irony, and then giving a narrative of the development of his opinions. In later editions he omitted the polemical pages, and when Kingsley died said a mass for his soul. The book was received with almost universal applause, yet it had not been easy for Kingsley to understand what Newman meant. His Grammar of Assent was so many times rewritten as to leave the impression that he himself did not easily ascertain his own meaning. It is curious to find him quoting a writer in the Penny Cyclopedia as an authority on the religion of the Australian tribes. The writer was not correctly informed. Newman's works range from 12 volumes of sermons, through treatises and essays, historical and critical, and polemical works, to novels of which Callista, a tale of the early Christians in Africa, is the best, and to poetry. In this, The Dream of Gerontius displays intense imaginative power, and Lead, Kindly Light, is the most admired of his religious lyrics. Perhaps this great and good man is most intelligible in his Life, by Mr. Wilfred Ward, 1912. In his love of truth, and in his courage and natural independence of mind, Newman was what we call thoroughly English. I am as little able to think by any mind but my own as to breathe by another's lungs, he wrote. As much might be said for two authors who differed from him so widely as Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, and Thomas Huxley, 1825 to 1895. The nature of their studies was, as a rule, remote from the literary, and must find record and criticism in the history of science. The greatness of Darwin's character and intellect is among the chief intellectual glories of his country. Huxley, apart from his own special researches, was the Tangrand of evolution, the popular fighting man, of a brisk humorous pugnacity, his mental lungs expanding in an atmosphere which would have asphyxiated Newman. He had very wide general reading. Of his more literary works his Life of David Hume in the series of English Men of Letters is an admirable example. He is not to be accepted as an impeccable authority on the religions of the more backward races. The same caution must be extended to the anthropological works of Herbert Spencer, a single-hearted seeker after truth, with a very peculiar scientific style of his own. Of all men who wrote much, and earnestly, and persuasively, Spencer was the least of a reader. To much good literature he was even antipathetic. His tastes may be studied in his autobiography. W. E. H. Lecky. Among historians of the later Victorian age, W. E. H. Lecky, 1838 to 1903, held a position which was all his own. He was not an explorer among difficult and ancient archives like Froude. He had not Froude's imaginative and pictorial genius, and power of bringing dead times and personages vividly before the inner eye. He had neither the wide general historical knowledge of Freeman, nor Green's combination of effective rhetoric with very considerable learning. The minute and laborious accuracy of Gardiner, focused on a space comparatively limited, was not his. It was said of him at the moment when, still very young, he produced his History of the Rise and Influence of the Spirit of Rationalism in Europe, 1865, that he seemed infinitely more familiar with Latin and French than with Greek and German. And so he continued to be. But he gave, to the general reader, the results of wide reading. He was as lucid as he was fluent, his style was unborrowed, but descended from that of the 18th century. And so candid was he, that he spoke of the honesty of the old pretender, James VIII and III, as heroic. Few historians have been so precocious, few more popular. Born in 1838, of a landed Irish family of Scottish descent, he was educated at Cheltenham College and Trinity College, Dublin. In his 23rd year he was already a published historical writer, leaders of public opinion in Ireland. He travelled in Spain, Italy, and France, and in 1865 published his work on the History of Rationalism, which was warmly welcomed, and remains a justly popular book. But, in accordance with the nature of historical science, it is such a history of rationalism, beginning with a study of the belief in witchcraft and the attendant cruelties, as a young man of talent, taking up the subject today, could no longer write. Much is adopted from Michelet, Maury, and Guérin. The psychology of the topic was, in 1865, unknown, and today only a very daring youth could aver that the Reverend Mr. Kirke published A Secret Commonwealth in 1691 or at any other date. But the work is full of interest for the general reader. The author won a deserved success, and was 31 years of age when he followed it up with his History of European Morals, a topic that might have taxed the erudition of the maturity of Gibbon. It involved a philosophical dissertation on the origin of morality, Lecky professing a theory of intuition, which, though opposed to rationalistic ideas, is not unsympathetic to some anthropologists. Though in knowledge of the ethics of savages, he could not, at the period when he wrote, be accomplished. Again, a study of Neoplatonism was involved, and had to be written without the aid of much psychological inquiry, posterior to the date of the work. The researches of the future antiquate works on such large subjects as the history of morals with ruthless rapidity. Lecky's works, so far, were in the manner of Montesquieu and other great French philosophes, but, while severe enough on the errors of the clergy, he had none of Gibbon's mischievous love of degrading the early Christian ideal. The central part of Lecky's literary career, till 1890, was engaged with his great work, The History of England in the 18th Century. This vast and important book is the useful successor of Macaulay's History, and is written with much fairness, though, as usual, a considerable mass of information has since accrued from materials not accessible to the author. This work is not only valuable as a political record, but for its close attention to the changes in thought, manners, literature, and society. Lecky was not, as an Irishman, likely to neglect the affairs of his native island where he had access to the archives in Dublin public offices. He was in politics a unionist, but did not conceal his dislike of the manner of the wooing. His other best-known works are Democracy and Liberty, and Historical and Political Essays. He sat in Parliament as the representative of his university, was the friend of all the most eminent men of letters of his time. And, thanks to the amiability of his character, he probably never had an enemy. With the name of Lecky this work must close, leaving in such brief record much excellent work unchronicled, as too recent to have passed into history. The end.